Hello, and welcome back to the Diogenes podcast. Today, we're going to continue with our discussion of wokeness as an epiphenomenon of cultural feminization. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. That was C.S. Lewis from God in the Dock, Essays on Theology. The long march through the institutions means hollowing out the sacred precincts of the culture, its art, its heroes, and political architects, along with the binding values its representations embody. Destroy the common culture by seizing its institutions and vilifying as ideological enemies those who seek to preserve its history, and tribalism does the rest. Divide and conquer. There is a war on Western civilization, on whiteness, and most especially on men. Our culture and civilization are gravely at risk, and as fathers, brothers, sons, and husbands, we, along with the good and sane women who love us and have better, more valuable things to do than wantonly tear men down, have a duty to stand fast and preserve what we can against this unwarranted hate. Politics, in theory, is representative and built out of votes. It is a series of sustained, deliberate, self-correcting actions undertaken with specific goals and objectives. Politicians and their policies are supposed to represent the will of the people who elect them. Politics is applied ethics. Culture, on the other hand, is sui generis. It exists at its own level, and it is the backdrop of collective experience, the milieu of ideas embodied in the representations we share to understand our world and our experience within it. Culture represents the aspirations of the people and is applied ontology, being, and experience. Left liberals and the woke put politics first because politics is power. Power to control minds through the culture, which is what the woke are doing, especially in increasingly female-dominated domains like education, media, psychotherapy, and jurisprudence. He who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past, wrote Orwell, or was it Paul Simon? Well, God bless the absentee ballot, that is. And she who controls the institutions that control people's mental lives controls the culture. And generations of activist academics and ersatz artists have inculcated hate for who we are in the minds of generations of students and spectators. Make no mistake, the left own the culture. The narcissistic reversal of the terms culture and politics and their roles in shaping society is another briar patch stratagem by the crafty left and their complicit, scared shitless media puppets. Traditional conservatives distrust big government meddling in the personal affairs of average citizens. As Socrates himself was at great pains to remind us, there is a principle of justice that the state should embody, namely that everyone is, quote, to do their own thing and not meddle with that of another, end quote. Conservatives resist authoritarian and elite institutional demands restricting individual choice, and they have never been more right in doing so, even when they are not exactly innocent themselves. The woke cultural revolution and its ever-ramifying taboos now define the moral terrain of the modern Western world. The value sets of cultural socialism promulgated by elite left liberals since the 1960s have long since percolated down to rural and working-class Americans, establishing new norms for acceptable behavior. In many cases, desegregation and the end of Jim Crow, the elimination of sexist double standards in the home and in the workplace, abortion rights, general tolerance of homosexuality, leading eventually to gay marriage rights, improved environmental stewardship, the effect has been broadly positive. But the problem with social justice is that it is not used as one of many lenses through which we can consider certain problems, but as a corneal transplant that allows us to see nothing but problems. And the woke demand that everyone undergo the procedure, doing the work, as Robin DiAngelo put it, so that we all see the world in the same way. And because social renorming has occurred as a result of unsystematized value shifts and emotional attachments, along with the ascendancy and dissemination of radical postmodern theories in the academy, These positive transformations have been distorted by the woke into a toxic identity politics. With the shift within liberalism from class to identity-based concerns, cultural and social membership have been redefined and reprioritized according to what the eminent historian, philosopher, and civil libertarian Isaiah Berlin called negative liberty, freedom from becoming more important than freedom to. This is a qualitative shift away from the opportunity for individuals to succeed and flourish within a shared set of values toward the obligation to protect vulnerable minorities from harm. It is not what one is committed to, but what one is opposed to that now determines individual social rank and value. In his eloquent defense of liberalism, The Crooked Timber of Humanity, Berlin wrote, quote, "The essence of man is freedom, and although there is talk of reason, harmony, the reconciliation of one man's purpose to that of another in a rationally organized society, yet freedom is a sublime but dangerous gift." And evoking Fichte, Berlin said, "Culture is not a deterrent of violence, but its tool." End quote. There is, of course, no perfect freedom, only trade-offs, and transcendent liberal values such as freedom and justice require that we weigh very carefully what we give away to obtain them. Quillette founder and editor Claire Lehman laments that the West has remorselessly jettisoned the culture that celebrates the great man theory of history. She writes, quote, "Today we acknowledge historical figures not for their feats, but for their crimes. Whether it is due to slavery, colonization, racism, or sexism, we tear down the monuments of our past while building no new heroes for our future." End quote. She continues, noting that the woke worldview is alienating and self-defeating, creating an unnecessary and destructive, quote, "tension between achievement and resentment," end quote. She reminds readers that male ambition matters and serves a purpose which, fulfilled, benefits us all. Of course, this is just as true for women, but saying so is redundant since they now constantly tell us all what is good for us, and it is most definitely not men. The present gynocratic cultural shift is redolent of the 1974 made-for-TV B-movie Planet Earth, in which a man awakens from suspended animation in the 22nd century, where women rule the world and men are now kept as slaves called dinks. I prefer Woody Allen's classic Sleeper, where it's finally admitted that steak, cream pies, and cigarettes really are the best things for you. The orb and orgasmatron keep the customer perpetually satisfied. The robots absolve us of our sins, and everyone can become a poet. What's a little autocracy if you can get a PhD in sex? But the woke see cultural capital as negation, not creation. Again, the underlying egalitarian impulse of this shift has conduced to necessary and meaningful gains, but with the triumph of therapeutic safetyism and the wanton stigmatizing of those who question the new codes and methods, wokeism has driven Langston Hughes' freedom train off the rails. The good poet wrote, "And there won't be no kind of color lines, the freedom train will be yours and mine. Black men and white will say, we want it so. Black men and white will say, ain't it fine." Written in 1947, this poem was then as urgent as a locomotive. Since then, 2 black Supreme Court justices, a Secretary of State, a VP, and a 2-term president have made it safely to the station, stopping in the country in the wide open air with no Jim Crow sign nowhere. This is called progress. But the woke act as if manacled blacks are still bobbing on the blood-churned, shark-infested waters depicted in J.M.W. Turner's 1840 tour de force painting, The Slave Ship. This sudden, unmitigated ethical expansion, especially within the last decade, has ballooned from a reasonable sensitivity to a calculated sacralization. On race alone, quote, "The egalitarian dial seemed to shift from 0, a dispensation offering maximum comfort to whites, to 11, one insisting on maximum comfort for African Americans, alongside the soft bigotry of assuming them to be fragile, with no intermediate position of optimizing across both groups," end quote. Of course, it doesn't end there. Quote, "The sacredness inherent in this new liberal taboo could be weaponized by the left and adopted to new objects, becoming the basis for a new religion," end quote. These new sanctified objects and identities include the fat, the ugly, the disabled, the neuroatypical, the mentally ill, immigrants, the indigenous, the queer and transgendered, and the OnlyFans slut. In fact, anyone or anything not white, not straight, not Western, and especially not male is now the standard by which all other individuals and civilization itself are judged and found lacking. Need more proof? How about this headline from Joanne Lippman, writing for the Wall Street Journal, February 28, 2025? Quote, "Can white men finally stop complaining? For 50 years, we've been hearing from men who feel threatened by the gains of women and minorities. Now that the manosphere is in charge, the victim mentality has to go." End quote. Here again, racism and sexism are being used to fight racism and sexism. Victim blaming is being used to fight victim blaming. And the asserted assumption that white men exclusively are in charge in a zero-sum game designed to perpetuate oppression drives another nail into the coffin of liberalism. Lippman's article is dripping with malice and resentment and is nothing more than a tu quoque fallacy. I know you are, but what am I? Tarted up as a determined stand against imaginary tyranny, which shouldn't be too hard to topple, as, quote, "the mighty white guy, it turns out, is quite the delicate flower," end quote. Smell me. Lippman dismisses out of hand any possibility that white men may have legitimate grievances, challenges, losses, or suffering, and all such complaints are framed as weakness, which would seem to reinscribe the normative expectation of stoic masculine fortitude, which is supposed to be so toxic, along with presuming that anything good for white men is detrimental to anyone else, and anyone else's success leaves white men feeling threatened. The woke are fanatically insistent on the systemic effects of oppressive regimes as an explanation for the undesirable outcomes of sacralized groups, but the hapless YTXY is on his own. As always, swap out the group in question for the sacred identity du jour to see how ethically grotesque this argument actually is. Ultimately, Lippman reaffirms her commitment to the narcissistic splitting, seeing people as all good or all bad, that forms the core of woke ideology. Us and them? Relax, honey. After all, we're only ordinary men. Wokeism has long since shifted from academic theory to public policy, impacting law, employment, grant funding, and medical and mental health treatment. It has led to totalizing and increasingly totalitarian renorming of mores and a destabilization of the moral predicates of Enlightenment liberalism, all as a way of shaming a designated oppressor class in the name of social justice. It's one thing to promote rarefied theories within elite intellectual circles. It is another to pursue change at the ballot box, but it is something else altogether to orchestrate the ideological capture of an entire culture through the compelled acceptance of a low-resolution worldview motivated by righteousness and resentment. Quote, "Stigmas are not like laws. Where laws involve logical consistency, balancing competing principles, and applying proportional penalties calibrated to the severity of an offense, taboos take a Manichaean black and white view of the world. With a taboo in place, little prevents a moral entrepreneur from waving this powerful moral wand to burnish their virtuous credentials or smear a political opponent." End quote. Once the culture has been captured, the arts and media become powerful force multipliers for the reproduction of radical values which seem increasingly invulnerable and inevitable, especially in the minds of those growing up knowing no alternative. The culture war is a civil war within liberalism itself. I use the term liberal here to define the policy making from center-left to center-right, which historically is where all meaningful and durable statecraft is accomplished. In On Liberty, John Stuart Mill notes the necessity of this foundational balance. Quote, "A party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life." End quote. The values of liberalism derive from the Enlightenment: secular humanism, reason and empiricism, respect for the rights of individuals, and the promise of measured progress. We risk losing these when, following the French Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu, the pursuit of equality becomes itself a form of domination. Quote, "The principle of democracy is corrupted not only when the spirit of equality is lost, but also when the spirit of extreme equality is taken up and each one wants to be the equal of those chosen to command." End quote. In Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu also wisely exhorts elites, both cultural and political, to remember that, quote, "To become truly great, one has to stand with the people, not above them." End quote. There is perhaps no better indictment of the arrogance of woke cultural socialism than the sagacious words of this great man who was so sadly white, wealthy too. Even sadder, Steven Pinker, author of Enlightenment Now, notes in his preface that, contra the pessimistic claims of Trump and his supporters circa 2018, America is not failing due to a loss of Christian moral guidance or succumbing to the unchecked predation of immigrant gangs, ideological subversion in the academy, or the internecine hostilities of cultural elites for the working class. Of course, all of those are, in fact, true. Pinker asserts rather that the Enlightenment ideals of reason, science, humanism, and progress are timeless and urgently relevant to counteract notions of progressophobia, which he views as a bipartisan affliction, which also is true. Pinker has a point that many factions exploit claims of cultural collapse to gain cred at the polls and push bogus solutions, and of course the media profit from the same negativity bias. However, Pinker here fails to account for the all-too-real effects of left-liberal cultural subversion on a country and culture that is exceptional because it was the first conceived directly as a product of the Enlightenment values he rightly champions. He disappointingly succumbs to a baby bathwater fallacy, along with a startling false equivalency argument that evinces an inexplicable disregard for his own thesis. In conversation with Francis Foster and Konstantin Kisin of the Trigonometry podcast, Pinker qualifies his position on Enlightenment values by noting that the West has also historically been the source of atrocities, e.g. Nazism, fascism, the wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the recent emergence of nationalism and charismatic populist strongmen, and women, gotta be inclusive, that twins Trump with Putin, and I would say Hillary with Pillary, because Madam Secretary's lax security over her emails in 2012 led directly to the fatal attack on the American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, despite foreknowledge of an impending al-Qaeda terrorist operation. But who's counting? Pinker observes, quote, "The idea that there was an American-led liberal international order is a little rose glasses-ish. There was more of a rules-based international order, but attributing it to the hegemony of the United States may be a misattribution." End quote. He notes that the West has been the source of humanistic and Enlightenment values, but some emerged from Eastern cultures as well, and that it is the values themselves, rather than Western cultural or political dominance, that truly matter. Due diligence, no doubt, and Pinker rightly and rationally emphasizes the importance of value sets over national or ethnic source points, ideas, not identities. Hear, hear. Yet there is something of the oikophobic apologetics of wokeism in Pinker's slippage in acknowledging Western exceptionalism, and Kisin appropriately pushes back. Kisin says, "Those are connected, Stephen, surely." Pinker, shrugging off the assertion, "Statistically, but they're not the same thing." Kisin, "What I'm saying is that if the West is not top dog in the world, the values you care about so much will not be the predominant values in the world. I'm stress testing what you're saying. It does sound to me, every time you bring up the fact that the West isn't perfect, you're sort of doing what the woke college students are doing, in that they're saying, well, why should we be happy to live in this country when we've done this and this? I'm saying I don't think our imperfections are reason enough to not want to maintain the values that the West at its best holds." Pinker then gives ground, acknowledging that to the extent that the West is aligned with those values, as a side effect, it would be better if the West predominated. I completely agree. It's the values that count. And indeed, it would be obtuse to deny that those values are way stronger in the West, however you define the West, including gender equality and gay rights and democracy and anything we want to venerate as a value. There's more of it in the United States than in Iran or Russia or China, so hooray for us." End quote. All's well that ends well, one supposes, But given his ubiquity as a public intellectual of such prodigious scope, Pinker's delayed defense of Western ethical and intellectual achievement is unacceptable. He gives short shrift to the outsized beneficial influence of the Western Enlightenment, which he elsewhere so rigorously defends, and offers no examples of comparable achievements arising outside the Western paradigm. There are, of course, examples of enlightened ideas and values arising in non-Western cultures. Tang Dynasty China, 618 to 907 CE, developed a merit-based civil service selection process. Scholars during the Islamic Golden Age, the 8th through the 14th centuries CE, made great advancements in mathematics, science, and medicine, and preserved the wisdom of Western classical antiquity while Europe remained in the so-called Dark Ages. India maintained a vibrant and complex philosophical tradition that included heterodox conceptions of individualism in the pursuit of knowledge and spiritual attainment. But just as versions of the Golden Rule have been independently conceived, Buddhism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, etc., it is the codification within Christian theology that stands out as morally exemplary, along with the epistemological integrity of the West's Enlightenment program, because only in the West were these ideas and values effectively systematized, giving rise to institutions and political processes able to reshape the culture with a progressive, error-correcting aim. This comprehensive set of principles and the development of institutions to make them practicable did not arise in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, or the Americas. They arose in Europe and are correlated with specific geographical resources and the innovations and adaptations associated with encountering and exploring new cultures and environments. And yes, conquest and colonization were often the result, but this is true of every culture, not merely white Europeans. In a long historical view, this has been a global civilizing process that has led to irrefutable moral and technological advancements that now benefit the entire world. Representative democracy, the rights revolutions, electricity, refrigeration, vaccines, flight, and fucking Pee Wee Herman. Have a Coke and a smile, people. While Pinker is far from woke, he takes a page from their playbook by emphasizing a kind of personally exculpatory denunciationism and emphasizing what the West got wrong as evidence of our unexceptionality. This is formally known as the historian's fallacy and is widely deployed by the woke as presentism, judging the past based on current knowledge of negative consequences as if they were always intended, inevitable, and are the sole defining features. This is related to survivorship bias, which the woke have used cunningly as strategic victimhood to emphasize plight over progress, securing social credits for minorities and absolving elites of their putative sins when they engage in public self-flagellation. These fallacies neglect complexity. They dismiss nuance, assuming that just because we got some things wrong, we were no good all along, or at least not so much compared to more noble others who are now entitled to destroy or take over what they could never create on their own. A declared fan of economist and historian Thomas Sowell, Pinker conveniently forgets or ignores Sowell's withering insight that, quote, those who say that all cultures are equal never explain why the results of those cultures are so grossly unequal, end quote. For a psychologist who has argued unashamedly for the importance of IQ as a measure of cognitive potential, Pinker seems suspiciously unwilling to acknowledge who the smart kids are. And in his reflexive disgust at Trump, without a deeper examination of the policies beyond the persona, the social conditions giving rise to Trump's political ascension, and the equally vulgar and starkly autocratic tactics of the American left to subvert a legitimate political figure with broad public support, Pinker's hedging against hegemony is unconscionable. So much for standing with the people and not above them. In comprehensively researched works, such as The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, to The Believing Brain, From Spiritual Faiths to Political Convictions, by historian of science Michael Shermer, to Pinker's own Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, Why It Matters, brilliant minds have sought to explain why smart people believe stupid things, why my side bias often supersedes common sense, especially in a political calculus, and why sane and educated people, drunk on their own superiority, are so susceptible to cognitive fallacies, particularly the argument from authority. The short answer is that we are not wired for the Enlightenment, but must learn to think critically and revise our priors, sometimes at the expense of our comforting but erroneous intuitions and received wisdom, along with the forfeiture of the moral license to dictate views and values to others. And such irrationality is entirely nonpartisan, but can be strategically manipulated by those with nefarious political agendas, such as right-wing radio nut Alex Jones' execrable claim that the slaughter of 26 children and teachers at the Sandy Hook School in 2012 was a hoax used to ban guns. On the left, Steven Pinker provides a glaring example of nonsensical double standards which undermine science as they underscore tribal spite. Pinker said, quote, "Probably the most egregious example was telling people that you should not get together in crowds for MAGA rallies during the pandemic, but it's okay to get in crowds for Black Lives Matter rallies because the cause is just so much more just." End quote. This was, of course, predicated on the woke claim that racism itself was and is a kind of pandemic. Pinker continues, quote, "That is a way of signaling, blaring, that the public health establishment is a house organ of the political left. I don't know how widely that message was received, but it would be absolutely toxic to the idea that the public health establishment is a disinterested source of information about public health." End quote. Disinterested, as in just the facts, no agenda. And disconfirmable, as in able to be disproved and revised in light of new information or evidence. Just as politics are downstream from culture, values are downstream from reality. But Pinker himself provides an example of how the brightest minds can rationalize themselves with authority and a magisterial marshalling of confirmation bias into contortions of denial. Pinker has acknowledged in multiple contexts that simply reading 100 of the great classics, even if the list includes Darwin's Origin of Species, won't make one educated, insisting that a grounding in the sciences is a prerequisite for a truly modern intellect. Okay, who would argue that that's a bad thing? But speaking as a former arts and humanities professor, I will rejoin that knowing the eigenvectors and eigenvalues that chart the rotation, shift, and shear in a digital remapping of the Mona Lisa onto, say, Picasso's Weeping Woman, not only fails to explain the epistemological significance of the perceptual reprioritizing from mimesis to cubism in Western art, but reveals absolutely nothing about these paintings' psychological resonance as portraits of actual human beings being painted by two artistic geniuses, one of them an improbable intellectual outlier. I prefer the conciliant Pinker, who in a deep essay entitled The Humanities and Human Nature writes, quote, "Commentators on fiction could have educated evolutionary biologists with their insight long ago," end quote. To wit, in more than one of his writings, Pinker has evoked the great literary critic George Steiner, who declared Sophocles' Antigone the greatest story ever told. Steiner wrote, quote, "It has, I believe, been given to only one literary text to express all the principal constants of conflict in the condition of man. These constants are fivefold: the confrontation of man and woman, of age and of youth, of society and of the individual, of the living and the dead, and of men and gods. Because Greek myths encode certain primary biological and social confrontations and self-perceptions in the history of man, they endure as an animate legacy in collective memory and recognition." End quote. And where did those insights first arise? Following this expression of coextensive ethical and aesthetic grace, there is the Steven Pinker of the keynote address at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education's anniversary in 2014. In his 3 Reasons to Affirm Free Speech address, Pinker concludes, quote, "It seems to me that educated people should know how to appreciate works of fiction and art as sources of aesthetic pleasure and as impetuses to reflect on the human condition. They should be acutely aware of human fallibility, most notably their own, and appreciate that people who disagree with them are not necessarily stupid or evil. Accordingly, they should appreciate the value of trying to change minds by persuasion rather than intimidation or demagoguery." End quote. Precisely. Otherwise, we may get all of the facts, but none of the flavor, all of the heat, but none of the light, all of the politics, but none of the culture. Remember, if you enjoy the content here on the Diogenes podcast, please like and subscribe and share your thoughts respectfully in the comments section. Until next time, I'm Chris. Thanks for joining me.